My name is Larry Bateman. I am a former IRS criminal investigation employee. Started with IRS in 1987, retired in 2012.
So Larry, can you give me a little bit of a background about your family life and kind of growing up?
Sure. So I grew up in Pocatello, Idaho. I was born in Utah. Spent my childhood in Pocatello. Went to school in Pocatello. Grade school up through college. I went to Idaho State University, which is where I got my undergrad degree. I graduated from undergrad with a degree in accounting in 1986, 87. And right out of college, I ended up going to work for the Internal Revenue Service. So I'd interviewed with the IRS on campus, actually interviewed with the civil side of IRS, and did not necessarily enjoy that experience. Didn't seem like that was the type of job I'd like to be involved with, but I also interviewed at the same time with the FBI. And the FBI seemed like a very interesting career. At the same time, I had found out about IRS Criminal Division, and they had an open announcement. And so concurrent to the FBI application, I'd also applied with the IRS. Got interviewed, got contacted first by the IRS, and the IRS was for a position in California, and they wanted to do a collateral interview in Boise. And so I came into the Boise office, interviewed in the Boise office of the IRS with the existing supervisor. The interview process then was a lot different than it is today. I sat down with him. We sat there and we just BS'd for about an hour. And at the conclusion of that, he goes, "Well, I'm going to recommend you for this job." He goes, "I think you'd enjoy it, and I think you'll have a great time in California." And so I talked to him about his experiences in the IRS and the criminal division. What he had done definitely sounded interesting. And so he did recommend me for the job, and I took the position straight out of college.
And was there anything when you were growing up that kind of steered you toward law enforcement at all?
No, I don't think so. I mean, when I came out of school, so let me back up. When I was growing up, I was the first person in my family not only to graduate from college, I was the first one to graduate from high school. My parents had GEDs. So there was not a lot of direction because they weren't in a position where they could really provide that because they didn't have that experience themselves. So they were always blue collar. They'd always worked hard. That's what you did. You go to school, you work hard, and you go figure out what you're going to do. So as I came out of high school, I'd always done well in school, but I didn't have any idea what I was going to do. I had good friends that had gone to college, and at the time, I was running a personal business with another friend where we were running a janitorial service. And so we ran a business in Pocatello where we cleaned several businesses. And at the time, I thought it was great money, and I was going, this is going to be a great way to make a living. But as we got further into it, and obviously you're young kids, and you're not making great decisions, and that turned out it wasn't gonna be what I was gonna do in life. So I had a friend who was in the accounting program at Boise State, as a matter of fact. I talked to him, and I said, "Well, I think I'll give that a try." So I went into business school at Idaho State and went through, got my degree. My degree was in accounting. And when I came out on the other side, I really didn't know what I was going to do. So I was just looking who was interviewing on campus at the time. IRS Criminal Division was one of those companies that had come in. Like I said, I'd interviewed with the civil side. Wasn't impressed with what that job was going to be. Not that I would downplay that at all. It just didn't seem like a good fit. And so the criminal division, like I said, was one of the jobs that was open and on campus, and so I ended up applied for that and talked to the local supervisor and spent a long time with him, over an hour, just talking about the job, what his experience had been, and that's how I ended up in the position.
Can you kind of explain? I think most people think of the IRS in the civil portion of it, where they're just going through tax records and looking at people. Can you kind of explain the difference between the civil portion of IRS and the criminal division of IRS?
Sure. So the civil division is, I think, what most people think of when they think of the IRS. And so you're talking about audits and you're talking about collections. And those are two of the largest components of the IRS. So, for example, right now they're talking about the 87,000 agents that are going to be hired. And those 87,000 agents are actually primarily on the civil side. And so those are, they refer to them as revenue agents. And those are the folks that will do civil audits. Collection division, they go out if you owe money to the IRS. The collection division is the part of the IRS that will collect that money once the civil side, the auditors have made an assessment, say this money is owed. The criminal side of IRS is a law enforcement function. You have full law enforcement powers. You're a federal agent, for example, with the same law enforcement powers as DEA, FBI, any other federal law enforcement agency. So you're going to carry a weapon. You have powers of arrest. You have powers of search and seizure, et cetera, et cetera. And so you are conducting criminal investigations. And those criminal investigations, what I used to tell people is if there is a crime that has a nexus to financial gain, a financial motive crime, there is some likelihood that IRS will be involved in that investigation. So the sort of crimes that the IRS would investigate, for example, the tax side, you're definitely going to investigate tax crimes, intentional tax evasion, where the intent was to actually evade your taxes as opposed to you made a mistake. So you'll investigate those crimes. We also work closely with our law enforcement partners at DEA through the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force, OCDF. Also with the FBI, we have agents that were assigned to the JTTF, Joint Terrorism Task Force. We work with inspector generals where they may, for example, Small Business Association or Small Business Administration right now is doing COVID relief fraud because that is a financially related crime. There is a likelihood, and I know that in fact IRS Criminal Division is heavily involved in COVID investigations. And so those are criminal investigations where the intent is not only to identify the person if they have received money fraudulently to get that money back, but the intent is also to punish those people by having them actually go to trial, potentially go to jail. If they benefited financially from those crimes, the IRS will try to identify the fruits of those crimes and take them back or take them away. They'll go into what's known as asset forfeiture.
So when you began your career, and I don't know if it's changed till now, what were the educational requirements to be a special agent with IRS? And if you know, have they changed over time?
So I think they're roughly the same, but at the time you had to have a 4-year degree. You had to have 24 core units in accounting, and you had to have, I think it was 15 units in business. I think, if I remember correctly. It was a long time ago. But that was essentially it. I know that a lot of the folks that I worked with, when they came in and I talked to them, they said, I always wanted to be in this position, but I had to go back to school because I had a business degree, but I didn't have the 24 hours in accounting, or I didn't have a business degree, and I needed to get those business core credits as well as the accounting credits. So I had to go back to school for a year to get those. So that was roughly what was the requirement at the time, and I think it's still the same.
And then how about your training? Once you got hired on as a special agent, what type of training did you have to go through? How long was it? What did it include?
So at the time, we would come into the office. We were hired into the office that, for example, I went to Southern California. I was hired in the Laguna Niguel office. And so Laguna Niguel, I would report to that office. I did report to that office, and I reported to, they call them OJIs, on-the-job instructors. So that is a senior special agent who has experience. When you first started, we did what were known as ISATs, which were introductory special agent training modules, if I remember the terminology, ISATs. There was a core group of those, like 25 of them that you had to do. And it would take you through, for example, arrest powers, search powers, how to conduct an interview, just a broad spectrum of the things you're going to do as an agent. while you were doing that, you were also being slotted to go to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, which was FLETC, which was located in Brunswick, Georgia. So Brunswick, Georgia was part of the core training that all agents went through. And we had 3 classes that we had to go through. The first one was basic special agent training. Trying to remember what the acronym was for that. But anyway, it was basic training. That training was given to all federal law enforcement officers. So when I went through, our class was actually made up of half IRS, half ATF agents, alcohol, tobacco, firearms. And I know that some of the other classes that were around my class, like we were class, I don't remember what the number was, but it'd be class 24. Class 24 had 12 special agents from IRS, 12 special agents from ATF. So there were other classes at the same time that had special agents from IRS there that we would, we'd interact with and we had, engagements with on, socially. Their classes were made up, for example, one had BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, was in there. Other one had Customs at the time. So there was a wide spectrum of agents that all trained at the Federal Law Enforcement Center. So you do the first class, which was basic agent training, and then you do the second class, which was criminal investigation of tax crimes, basically tax law, and then you would do SATE, which was special agent investigative techniques. So those 3 classes combined were about 6 months long, and so you do 6 months at the Federal Law Enforcement Center. You do that in conjunction with the ISATs that you were doing back in your office. The way that they did that at the time is you would go down to one class, then you'd go back to your office. Then you'd come back for another class, you go back to your office. So that has changed, and that today, all of those classes, once you arrive, you're going to go through all of them in one set instead of returning to your office.
So when you're back at Glencoe, how does your training as an IRS special agent differ at all from, say, an ATF in respect that, are you doing firearms training as well? Are you having, arrest techniques? How is the IRS training similar or not similar to traditional law enforcement, state and locals?
Sure. So that first class, the basic agent investigative training, that's not what it was called, but it was the special agent training that was given to all of the federal agencies. That is the same for all federal agencies. So we did search and seizure. We had to write affidavits. I mean, the way the class was structured is you would come in, you would be assigned an investigation, you would figure out what you needed to do in that investigation, and you had to go and interview people, and it was set up so that you would interview actors that had information available. Your interviews would be recorded so that you could be critiqued at a later time. These are the things that worked for you, these are the things that didn't work for you, and this is the information you would have received had you asked for it, and or you did ask for the correct information. So you would get a basic module on interviews, and then from interviews you would go over and what's the next step you're going to take in this investigation. Well, as it goes along, you're going to do a search warrant, and so you have to draft the search warrant affidavit. You have to go to a judge, you have to get the search warrant approved. And so they're looking at it from a legal perspective. Did you include the elements needed to get authorized to execute the search warrant? So now you've got the search warrant approved, now you're going to execute the search warrant. So you're going to put together a search team and a search plan and an entry plan to get into the place you're going to search, all the things that you're going to do for the rest of your career. You're going to do that search, you're going to get the evidence, you're going to bring it back, you're going to work the evidence, and you're eventually going to work towards an indictment. You're going to go before the grand jury, you're going to testify, you're going to get the indictment if the grand jury agrees factually you've got the evidence for that indictment, and then you're going to go to trial. And so the trial will be the witnesses that you've talked to before. They're character actors. There's going to be a judge who's actually out of the legal department at Glencoe, who's an actual attorney. And you're going to go through an actual, it's not an actual trial, but it's a trial and training. So all of the things that are occurring in that trial are the same sorts of things you're going to do in a real trial. So you're going to be cross-examined if you testify as the agent, which you're always going to testify in that environment. And the attorneys, the defense attorneys, are going to be extremely hard on you, probably harder on you there than they'll ever be in real life. And the judge is not going to give you any relief from that perspective. They want to see what you are going to do under pressure in real life. So that training is everybody's training, special agent training across the board. The way that IRS differs and the way that every agency differs is that you then go into your agency's specific training. So ours is SATE, Special Agent Investigative Techniques. And so those are methods of proof that we use to prove crimes, and we work financial investigations. And so the investigative techniques that we are taught there are specific to financial investigations and methods of proof that we're going to be able to prove. For example, if you were a drug dealer and you're in your life as a drug dealer, you've set up multiple levels of shell companies to try to conceal your wealth and try to make it so that the government can't determine what you're worth. There's a method of proof that's, for example, it's called net worth, that would go through that particular drug dealer and be able to demonstrate that at a point in time they were worth this, today they're worth this. They have gotten a job that they represent, that they work, that is something that would bring their net worth somewhere down here. So there's obviously a problem, and a criminal problem. I mean, we're going through to show that how they actually made their money, and we're working with our partners. For example, in that case with DEA, DEA is going to develop the drug evidence in that case. We'll develop the financial side of that case. That case will go to trial. If it goes the way that we think it would, that person will be convicted, and the proceeds of their crime will be taken back by the government.
Okay. And so, getting back to your career, you hired on, well, at least you did your first interview in Boise. Where was your first office that you went to?
So my first office was in Southern California, Laguna Niguel, which is 40 miles south of Los Angeles. At the time, Los Angeles and Laguna Niguel were two separate offices, and now that field office extends from north of LA down to San Diego, all the way out to Hawaii, I think.
And when you started, what are some of the first kind of cases that you started working on as a new agent?
So when you start as a new agent, you're not necessarily doing your own work. You're doing a lot of gopher work, and I definitely did a lot of gopher work. So the first case I worked on, I was assigned to a senior special agent. So the senior special agent, in the federal government, the way it works is you have to be able to do 20 years to retire. So you can't start later than 37 because you have a mandatory retirement, all federal agents do, of 57. So federal agents have to retire by age 57, so you can't start later than 37. The person that I worked my first case with, I didn't work the case. I was helping him prepare that case for trial. He had gotten an exemption. So he actually started as a special agent beyond 37. He at the time was the oldest federal agent in the IRS. He was 63 when we took this case to trial. So this case that we took to trial was a guy who was affiliated with a particular religion who had ripped off all of the people in this religion. And so he had stolen all their money, representing that he was going to invest it, and he didn't invest it, he just took it. And I learned a lot in that investigation from the perspective of what it takes to get a case ready to trial, because that case did go to trial. One of the jobs I got initially was I got about 40 subpoenas that I had to serve all around Southern California. So when I started with the IRS, I had spent no time in the big city, and all of a sudden I'm going into every neighborhood you can imagine in Southern California. And at the time, there was no Google Maps. We used what were called Thomas guides. Thomas guides were about this thick. They were arranged by county. So you had Riverside County, San Bernardino County, San Diego County, Los Angeles County, and Orange County. Those were the 5 counties in Southern California. And I remember I used to sit there the night before trying to map out how I was going to serve these subpoenas. And I would make copies of the pages of the map so that I could put them next to me, and I'd connect them so that I could follow this trail as I served these subpoenas. And that was the first job I ever really had. And at the time, you didn't make a lot of money, but you had to stay in a lot of parking garages. And so you'd go into these parking garages where you have to park while you're going to serve subpoenas. I remember I was double timing it because I didn't want to spend money to pay parking fees. You get the parking fees back, but a month later. So that was the first job I had. And on that investigation, I actually went with that agent to the trial. And I did a bunch of interviews with him as well. And I remember we were going to we call them target interviews. So we were going to interview the main guy. We went to his house, and nobody answered the door. He says, "Oh, we'll just stick around." So we stuck around until 10 o'clock at night. And he shows up, and he immediately comes up to our car, and he starts to berate us. "You've scared my wife. She's in the house, and you guys have been sitting out here all day." And when you're 63, I guess you get to the point where you've probably seen a lot. And so my OJI, my on-the-job instructor, looks at him, and his only comment was, "Well, maybe she should have answered the door." That case did go to trial. His son was also a member of that trial. His son, I think he was in his 30s at the time, and he likened himself to be a real tough guy. And so he had started to reach out. He knew who the witnesses were that were going to testify, and he started to try to intimidate them into not testifying. So he also got charged with obstruction of justice, and they both were convicted on all counts. So it was a good first experience.
So from Laguna Niguel, how long did you spend in that office, and then where did you eventually go to?
So I started in Laguna Niguel, 1987. I spent 10 years there. So I worked in Laguna Niguel from 87 to 97. In 1997, I applied to be a supervisor, and I was selected as a supervisor in Seattle. And so myself and my family moved from Laguna Niguel to Seattle in 1997. We were there until 2002. In 2002, the Boise office had opened up, which is where I did my initial interview for the position to begin with. And at the time, and both of our families were here, and so there wasn't, the position was a lateral from Seattle to Boise. And I remember my boss at the time told me, he goes, "We're willing to put you in Boise." He goes, "But I want to be clear, this is not a promotion." And because everybody in not only in IRS but in federal agencies, there's a progression, and the progression is if you decide you're going to go into management, you're going to go as a first line supervisor, and then second line supervisor, maybe in the field, but you always rotate through Washington, D.C. And that was where they were trying to get me to go at the time, was to go through Washington, D.C. But they did allow me to come to Boise. So I worked here in Boise from 97 to 2002. During that time, I actually took a couple of temporary duty assignments in Washington, D.C. So I spent about a year in Washington, D.C. during that time. In 2002, the IRS had what they called career boards. So the career board was made up of senior managers in IRS, 3 senior managers. They would contact you telephonically and interview you. At the conclusion of the interview, you'd get a piece of paper that said, "You're doing a good job, you can stay in place. You're doing a good job, but we think you need to go to DC. Or you're not doing a good job, we're going to remove you from management." And so my piece of paper was, "You have to go to DC." So they gave me a year to report. During that time, my family was very entrenched in Boise. They didn't want to go to DC. So I had actually accepted an assignment and decided after I had accepted it that I couldn't do it. So I contacted my supervisor, who was in Seattle, said, "I'm not going to be able to go to DC." And so they changed my disposition from you have to go to DC to you'll be allowed to go back to the field. So I went back to the field as an agent in 2002. At the time, I worked as an agent for another 97, 2002. I worked as an agent for, trying to figure out the timing here, I think for 3 years. After 3 years, a position opened in Australia to actually open that office. And I applied for it and got it. And so I went as a attaché to Australia to Sydney and opened the office for the IRS there. The only reason I did it was at the time the family was going to go, but then they ended up not going. But I thought it was going to be a great opportunity to get everybody over there, but we split. So I had a family here and I was working in Australia. So I was down there for 3 years. And at the conclusion of those 3 years is when I retired.
So can you kind of explain a little bit about what does IRS do overseas, like Australia? What were your jobs? What were your responsibilities as the attaché for IRS over there? And what type of things did you work on?
So sure, the position it's called Special Agent International Affairs. So it's essentially you are assigned to a region. So my office was assigned to the Asia Pacific region, and so to open that office originally it had been worked out of Hong Kong. We had an office in Hong Kong. They decided to split Hong Kong with Australia, so they opened Australia, and there's about 35 countries that I was responsible for in Australia. And so the work that we would do down there, we did liaison work with, for example, the Australian Federal Police, the New Zealand Police. We would do outreach and contact with those agencies that our investigators in the United States would need assistance from. And so you had to establish those relationships. And a lot of them, like I said, it was not like we had never been there before, but we worked it from Hong Kong. So it was just a matter of establishing closer relationships, first name sort of relationships. Part of the things that we did, part of the duties that we did down there were to provide financial investigative training. So we had a lot of training sessions that we ran. For example, we ran a training in Australia with the Australian Federal Police, with the New Zealand Police, and with their counterparts on the civil side, the ATO, Australian Taxation Office, as well as the New Zealand Taxation Office. We did training, same sort of training in Indonesia that we provided with, at the time, Customs. So we do that part of the job was a training component to make sure that the things that we find work for us, we would provide that same sort of training to our counterparts, and also they would give us feedback as to here's some of the things that we do, and to the extent that what they did that we did that would be useful to us that we weren't doing, we could incorporate back into our training, and we would provide that information to the federal law enforcement training staff that our people at the federal law enforcement training would provide to new agents. The other thing that we did is our agents work globally on investigations. And so, for example, there was one particular investigation out of Fiji, or I take that back. The investigation was in Las Vegas. So the investigation started in Las Vegas. And again, it was a Ponzi scheme, and the person who was responsible for stealing the money from the people in Las Vegas was convicted at trial, and then he fled the country. And so he went to Fiji, and he actually had Fijian citizenship. And so I would go over to Fiji. I actually worked with the State Department, who was on site in Fiji. We identified the person, and we get that information back over to the United States, and we're dealing with the Department of Justice, who is trying to get extradition of that person from Fiji. And so we would provide the assistance they needed, and they would ask us for certain things that we could liaison with Fiji and get that information back quickly. And we ended up getting that person extradited from Fiji. So I did go over when he was extradited, as did the U.S. Marshal Service, who was responsible for extradition. And we coordinated to pick him up and get him out of the country. So that was one of the things. Another example would be out of Washington, our Washington D.C. office. We had an agent who was working. It's called FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act case. And so essentially, what that says is that a United States company has to adhere to United States law regardless of where they're working. So if they're working internationally, they still have to adhere to United States law. And one of the things that you find internationally is that there are certain countries where there's an expectation that to do business in that country, you're going to bribe foreign officials. And so that is unfortunately kind of the environment these countries or these companies have to work in. And most of those companies are going to do so honestly, but sometimes, and maybe not even consciously in the United States, their counterparts that are representing them in these countries are going to bribe officials, provide the things that they're looking for so that they can facilitate working in that country more easily. There's a great example of that where Walmart in Mexico was fined $350 million by the United States for FCPA violations because they were trying to establish a Walmart in, I think it was Mexico City. And in order to do that, Mexico was one of those countries where at the time to get things done, you had to agree to bribe certain officials. So they bribed those officials, they got the Walmart open, and it became a big internal investigation. I think actually, if I remember right, I was involved in that case, but I think Walmart actually self-reported. And at the end of that, it's obviously a hit to their reputation, but also the Department of Justice is going to fine those folks for the acts that they did. And Walmart, I think, was fined $350 million, if I remember correctly. But anyway, so we would facilitate internationally those components that those agents working domestically need. So if they need to have a evidence lead tracked down, and this FCPA case out of Washington, D.C. did, they had an evidence lead where they needed an interview conducted in Darwin, which is on the western side of Australia. And so working with the Australian Federal Police, I was able to facilitate getting that interview completed and getting that information back to that agent. So you're doing internationally, you're doing the components of the investigation that the domestic agent needs done. And in some instances, you're also facilitating travel to those countries if the evidence is complicated enough or the need is complicated enough. The government will send those agents to do those things personally. But in order to do that, their entry into the country, the things that they can do in country while they're there, all of those things have to be coordinated through the international liaison.
How many? Can you give me a kind of a guess? How many countries do you think that the IRS is actually located in?
So there are attachés that are working abroad. I think there's only, I think it's less than 15, if I remember right, currently. Having said that, the responsibilities for those agents, like when I was in Australia, that's why I said, I had responsibility for 35 countries. So I didn't visit 35, never made it to Tahiti, which was very unfortunate. But I had responsibility for Tahiti. So had I had a lead that needed from the United States that would have involved Tahiti, I would likely have gone to Tahiti and established the contacts so that I could figure out, what was available, how were we going to get it, and I would make the contact with the State Department people that were on site, working out of Tahiti, those sorts of things. But actual physical offices, I think, is less than 15, still to this day.
I had a question for you, because people will go their entire career just working as a special agent, just as an agent out in the field. And you had mentioned that you wanted to get, at some point, you put in for a promotion to become a supervisor. Can you kind of give me some ideas about why you wanted to do that? What were your thought processes of becoming a supervisor as opposed to just remaining a line agent?
So sure, I think the thought process that went into it at the time was just the ability to have a broader impact. And so, as a special agent, particularly in IRS, the financial investigations are slow. I mean, there are investigations that I reviewed when I was in management where it's called RP, Review and Program Evaluation, where you go into other field offices to do reviews of their office. And I know that we did a review once where there was an investigation that had been open for 7 years. And so that's obviously a very long-term investigation, and that ties up tremendous resources in that office, but it can also tie up the total resources of a particular agent. And so that agent in an investigation that complex is going to spend the majority of their time on that investigation. And it was not unusual within a 1-year period for special agents the average was to complete 2 investigations a year. And those would be on cycles, right? Because it would take typically a year to complete an investigation. So you may have one investigation that completes, another one that you started that's halfway through. So the work was, it was very in-depth, very complex, but because of that factor, you didn't have the ability to make a broader impact because you were very focused on what you were doing. And so as a supervisor, for example, you would look at a program, and I did when I was working as an agent, and you say, this program is ran this way. And programs are, for example, whether it's tax investigations, OCDF investigations, JTTF, the things that we talked about before, how IRS participates in those task forces or the work that we do or training that we do or any number of things. So as an agent, you can say, hey, here's an idea. We should consider this. And somebody may take the ball and run with that, or somebody may not. But when I went into supervision, I would like to have a broader impact. And I think I was pretty comfortable in the work that I was doing. And I liked working with people. And so as a supervisor, you have the ability to affect everything that's going on in the group or in the team that you're working with, so that you can talk to agents and counsel them about, here's some pitfalls that I might have experienced that you should look out for. Or as we go through and we have an investigative plan, here's some things that that are probably worth considering. Here's some of the things that, maybe I did while I was working as an agent, and, to save you the pain, I'm just telling you that maybe that's something you don't want to do. And also, as you get into headquarters in Washington, D.C., like I said, I did a couple TDYs, temporary duties there. And when I worked in our headquarters, I worked in our narcotics and counterterrorism section. And so one of the jobs that I had when I worked there is I worked directly with the Treasury Department, and we were talking about FATF, which is a Financial Action Task Force. And so Treasury deals with FATF, and they call it the FATF 40+9. And those are the anti-money laundering rules that globally countries have to comply with. And so working directly with Treasury, we're saying, okay, in this particular rule, does this work? How can we tweak it? And so we were working with Treasury to talk about specific FATF rules because they had a plenary which was coming up in Paris where the United States was going to present. And so we were dealing with Treasury to say, is there any changes that we should suggest to the broader body that will make the anti-money laundering laws better, or is there a tweak that will work universally for all countries? So you have the ability to do those sorts of things as you progress in the agency, whereas you probably would not be doing that work unless it was on a temporary assignment as an agent.
Okay. Can you talk about any interesting cases at all that you think people in general may find interesting about what an IRS agent might have done, a special agent might have done?
Sure. Well, I'll give you the after I stepped out of management and went back in the field, we had a issue in another state where our office had to recuse itself because the investigation was going to involve a senior senator from that office, from that state. So there's only 2 senators per state, and because of the exposure to that senator, they recused that entire state from working on that investigation. And so I was assigned to work on that investigation. It was a political corruption investigation. And I worked, I would go to that state every two weeks for 2 weeks at a time, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. And the investigation was concerning the senior senator as well as a number of state representatives. And so we did search warrants. At the time, we did search warrants on that were executed at the state capitol as well as at the senator's home. And that received substantial publicity at the time. And we had convicted a number of the state senators, and we ended up indicting this federal senator, the senator for the state, and that trial actually occurred in Washington, D.C. And so we moved the entire operation from that state to, it's called PIN, Public Integrity Section of the United States Department of Justice. And that case was prosecuted from PIN out of the Department of Justice. And the case agents, as well as all the evidence, was moved to Washington, D.C., where we had that trial, which was a very, I want to say, I don't remember exactly, I think it was about a 6-week trial. But the character witnesses for the defense included 2 U.S. senators, as well as Colin Powell, who obviously has a great deal of notoriety. So it was definitely an interesting case.
And was that something that IRS actually led then, that investigation?
That investigation, which a lot of times with all of those types of work, that type of work, we're dealing with our law enforcement partners. So that was a joint IRS FBI investigation that was led from PIN, Public Integrity Section, from the Department of Justice, with participation of the U.S. Attorney's Office in that state.
2 questions for you. After all your time in law enforcement, can you tell me how your law enforcement career, if it did, affected your family life? And then has it affected, and did it affect your views on society and people in general?
I would say it definitely affected my personal life. After I went to Australia by myself, it's obviously very hard on a family. I ended up getting divorced. So that was, and obviously not a direct result, but it was certainly a contributing factor. So I also had kids at the time that I spent many years as part of my career in travel status, whether it was in working in investigations or working in management. So, it gave me an opportunity. I've been able to travel, large parts of the world that I never would have had the opportunity to do. But the personal cost of that is definitely a tangible byproduct. And so I did end up getting divorced, and I think in part because of I was gone a lot. And so it certainly has an effect on you. Having said that, I would also say the agents that don't want to travel, also, for the most part, will be able to spend their entire career in one office if that's what they want to do. And so they will work out of that office. They'll work all of their criminal cases out of that office. You'll travel for those investigations as needed, but most of your time will be spent in the office. So if that's something that, for anybody that was interested in the position and didn't want to put up with the travel portion of that, there are certainly ways not to travel extensively or, just very rarely. How does it affect my views of society? I would say this. I tell people this all the time. At a federal level, if the federal government issues an indictment, whether that person is convicted or not, there's a high degree of likelihood that the person at least did what the government thinks or is going to allege they did. Because the federal government is very methodical, very meticulous. They deal with Department of Justice, which is typically very conservative, and the standard is there's got to be beyond a reasonable doubt before we're going to bring an indictment. So I would say that when I view people that are facing federal indictment, I'm probably not the guy you want on the jury, because in a jury pool, I would say I would tend to believe that person's guilty. From a broader perspective in society, the only thing that I think that has really affected me is that I do believe, based on the experience in the federal government, that most people trust people more than they probably should. I trust my family, I trust my friends, but I would just say that it is to your benefit to always analyze things critically. And so I don't have a lesser view of society as in general. There's a great article, I think it's called Wolves, Sheep, Wolves and Sheep. Anyway, wolves, sheep, and sheepdogs. Sheepdogs are described as the protectors of the sheep, and the wolves are always trying to get the sheep. And so, in the context of law enforcement, sheep are the general population, the wolves are the people that prey on that population, and sheepdogs are the law enforcement officers that protect that population. And I think most people, in the article would make the point that most people are sheep and they're fine being sheep, but just know that you can be a sheep because there are sheepdogs that are there to make sure that society operates within the norms that it was set up to operate within.
Thank you, Larry. Appreciate it.
You bet.